Part 1. What medieval princess life was really like. Hey guys, tonight we begin with something soft and glittery. Well, glittery in the sense of gold-threaded gowns that smelled faintly of mildew and candle smoke. We're talking about medieval princesses. Now, when you hear princess, the modern brain tends to conjure up pastel dresses, maybe a tiara that fits comfortably, a talking animal sidekick, and of course, a strong-willed personality who just wants to be free. Disney has done its work. But medieval reality was, let's say, significantly less sparkly. More wool undergarments, less musical number. So tonight, dim the lights, get comfortable, and prepare to drift into a world where being born a princess meant being both impossibly privileged and simultaneously trapped in a kind of gilded misery. Because really, when your entire life plan is laid out at birth, including who you're going to marry, what country you'll be shipped off to, and how many babies you're expected to produce before you die in childbirth, well, it's not quite the Cinderella fantasy. Let's glide into the nursery where most medieval princess stories begin. Royal babyhood, the first draft of a diplomatic treaty. A medieval princess wasn't just a cute baby. She was basically a living, swaddled contract. From the moment she squawked into existence, the court began calculating her value, not in hugs, but in alliances. Was she the key to peace with France? Could she cement a claim to a duchy? Would she at least fetch a decent dowry if all else failed? So yes, congratulations to the queen on her healthy baby girl. But also, quick, start drafting potential marriage treaties before the infant can even focus her eyes. It was not uncommon for royal children to be betrothed while still in the cradle. Imagine being promised to a 40-year-old count before you even had teeth. Of course, as infants, princesses didn't exactly live the soft life of baby influencers with pastel nurseries. Their cradles were ornate, yes, but the rooms were often freezing. Palaces were big, drafty stone boxes with poor insulation. The fancy drapery helped a little, but not much. So, princesses were usually bundled within an inch of their lives, swaddled tightly like tiny burritos of royal obligation. Nannies, wet nurses, governesses, and attendants hovered constantly. The queen herself, their mother, often didn't do much hands-on parenting. She was busy either producing more heirs or running ceremonial duties. So the princess was raised by a small army of women whose job was to make sure she survived long enough to become politically useful. Survival, by the way, was not guaranteed. Even royal babies were prone to dying of fevers, stomach bugs, or, frankly, general medieval unsanitarianness. But if you made it past the terrifying infant years, you graduated into the world of child princesshood, which is where the grooming really began. Childhood, groomed for glitter, shaped for diplomacy. Childhood for a princess was half etiquette training, half waiting to be shipped abroad. Lessons began early, reading and writing if you were lucky, but let's be honest, education was not always prioritized for royal girls. More often it was embroidery, manners, and memorizing an endless list of saints so you could look appropriately pious when needed. You'd also be trained in music. Every princess was expected to at least pluck a lute, warble through a hymn, or sit politely while someone else performed. Dancing was also essential, not because there were balls every night, this wasn't 18th century Vienna, but because moving gracefully in public was a form of soft power. A princess needed to glide rather than stomp. And then there was appearance. Hair had to be long, shiny, and often braided into elaborate styles that were heavy enough to cause mild neck pain. Skin should be pale, because tanning meant you looked like a peasant who actually worked outdoors. So princesses were often kept indoors, slathered with lead-based face powders, and generally treated like decorative porcelain, which, yes, was terrible for the skin. Some of them ended up looking less like glowing maidens and more like flaking marble statues. Playtime existed, but even that was strategic. Princesses might have dolls, little carved horses, or miniature chests of jewelry. But their main games were often imitations of adult roles, practicing how to serve at table, reciting courtly phrases, or pretending to preside over a small retinue of maids. Childhood, in other words, was basically a slow rehearsal for the moment you'd be married off. Betrothals, engagement rings before baby teeth. By the age of 6 or 7, many medieval princesses were already engaged. Not to boys their age, oh no, to adult kings, dukes, or noblemen who needed an alliance sealed. So while you were still struggling to read your psalms, somewhere a treaty was being signed declaring that you'd be sent to Hungary at 14 to marry a 30-something man with gout. Sometimes these betrothals fell through. Politics shifted. Wars broke out. A dowry suddenly looked less attractive. So a princess might spend her entire childhood technically engaged to 3 or 4 different men in sequence. The whole process turned them into bargaining chips, with their futures shuffled around like pawns on a chessboard. And when the time finally came, there was no real choice in the matter. Princess marriages were not about love. They weren't even about compatibility. They were about which 2 royal families needed to stop stabbing each other for 5 minutes. The bride was just the ceremonial glue. Marriage by proxy, the awkward pre-wedding. One of the strangest customs was the marriage by proxy. This happened when 2 families agreed to marry off their children but couldn't immediately bring them together. So instead, a stand-in, often a court noble, literally went through the wedding ceremony as the groom's substitute. Yes, that means some princesses were technically married to a random guy who stood there holding their hand while vows were exchanged on behalf of the absent husband. The groom might be hundreds of miles away, eating roast boar and not thinking about it. The princess was then considered legally bound, even though she hadn't yet met her real husband. Imagine being 12, in a gown that weighs more than you do, standing next to a middle-aged courtier who is pretending to be your fiancé. It was less fairy tale, more bizarre rehearsal dinner. Moving abroad, the goodbye nobody wanted. And then came the departure. Few things were sadder in a princess's life than the moment she was sent off to her new country. Once a marriage was confirmed, the bride packed up her belongings, kissed her family goodbye, and often never saw them again. This was not like moving to another city. This was permanent exile. The send-off process was ceremonial. Dowry chests filled with jewels, gold, or sometimes literal sacks of grain would accompany the bride. Ladies-in-waiting traveled with her, chosen carefully to maintain the proper influence. And once she crossed the border into her new husband's lands, everything changed. New language, new customs, new servants, and often a chilly reception from courtiers who saw her as a foreign intruder. Some princesses adapted well, becoming beloved queens in their adopted homes. Others were lonely, isolated, and constantly accused of siding with their birth families in political matters. Either way, it wasn't exactly a warm welcome. Marriage life, the baby machine years. Once married, a princess's job narrowed down to one thing: produce heirs. Sons were the priority. Daughters were fine, but not the goal. A queen who gave birth to boys was praised. A queen who gave birth to girls was pitied. And a queen who gave birth to nothing was usually blamed, regardless of whether the husband was the problem. Childbirth, of course, was dangerous. Mortality rates were high. Many princesses died before reaching 30, their bodies worn out from constant pregnancies. And the irony? Some of these marriages meant the husband wasn't even particularly interested. He might prefer mistresses, politics, or warfare. But duty demanded that the princess keep trying, year after exhausting year. Court life, glitter, gossip, and silent suffering. When not pregnant, a princess was busy with ceremonial appearances. This meant endless feasts, processions, and church services where she sat silently, looking regal, while men debated politics around her. She was expected to be beautiful, devout, and obedient. Basically, the medieval equivalent of a royal Instagram filter. Behind the scenes, however, life was more complicated. Court was a hotbed of gossip, betrayal, and passive-aggressive competition. Princesses were constantly measured against other noblewomen, judged for everything from their fashion sense to their fertility. They had very little privacy and even less true freedom. Some coped by throwing themselves into religion, sponsoring convents, or surrounding themselves with confessors. Others turned to patronage of the arts, commissioning poets or painters. A few
indulged in affairs, though this was risky and could ruin them completely if discovered. And so when we think of medieval princess life, the picture is less ball gowns and glass slippers, and more strategically bred teenager with a lifetime subscription to obligation. We'll continue floating through their world in Part 2, where we'll look at what daily routines were like, from meals and fashion disasters to the endless etiquette that dictated every breath they took. Part 2. A princess's daily routine. So, you're a medieval princess. You've been betrothed since childhood, carted off to a foreign land, and dressed up like a heavily embroidered mannequin. But what does your actual day-to-day life look like? Let's dim the candles, set aside our illusions, and walk through the schedule. Spoiler, it was a lot less fun frolic in the castle gardens, and a lot more try not to sweat under 6 layers of brocade while everyone judges you. Mornings. Wake up in a drafty stone box. The day usually began at dawn, which in medieval terms meant the sun coming up and the bells tolling, not an alarm clock you could snooze. You'd be roused by servants entering your chamber, because of course you didn't wake up alone. Privacy wasn't really a thing for medieval princesses. Your ladies-in-waiting would gather, bustling around the bed, while you rubbed your eyes and tried not to look too human. They'd open shutters, letting in a wave of icy air, start a fire in the hearth, and fetch water. Not warm, luxurious bath water, just a basin for splashing your face and maybe rinsing your hands. Hygiene was minimal. Daily baths weren't standard, partly because heating that much water was a hassle, and partly because doctors of the time were convinced that bathing made you vulnerable to disease. So yes, most medieval princesses were basically perfume bombs. The morning wash was really just a light dab on the face, teeth sometimes rubbed with a cloth, and then powders and scented oils to cover the rest. Your chamber would smell of lavender, rose water, and, if we're being honest, a faint undertone of musty wool. Dressing, the endless layers. Next came the fun part, dressing, which wasn't something you did yourself, heavens no. Clothes were so complicated that it took a team. Think of it as a daily NASCAR pit crew, but for silk and laces. First, the chemise. This was the plain linen underdress, basically your medieval underwear. Over that went the kirtle, a more fitted gown that actually shaped your figure. And finally, the outer gown, which was the expensive, heavy, and absurdly impractical piece everyone saw. Velvet, brocade, fur trim, the works. Some weighed upwards of 20 pounds. Yes, wearing your wealth literally came at the cost of spinal health. Then came the accessories. Girdles, fancy belts, jewelry, sleeves that dragged along the floor because apparently practicality was a sin. And of course, headgear. Depending on the century, you might have worn a wimple, basically fabric that wrapped around your chin like a medieval neck brace. Or later, the iconic hennin, those tall, pointy cone hats with veils trailing down. They looked dramatic, but were basically fabric traffic cones balanced on your scalp. By the time you were fully dressed, you were less a human being and more an art installation. Breakfast, or not really. Here's where modern expectations get crushed. Breakfast, as we think of it, wasn't really a medieval thing. Ordinary peasants might have bread and ale in the morning, but princesses didn't typically sit down for a formal breakfast. Instead, they might have a light bite, bread, cheese, or watered wine, and then move on with the day. Meals were more of a twice-a-day event, a big dinner at midday and a supper in the evening, which meant your mornings were spent slightly hungry, distracted by the sound of your stomach while everyone expected you to look serene and holy. Religious duties, so many prayers. Religion dominated daily life. As a princess, you were expected to set a pious example, which translated to a lot of time in chapels, morning prayers, mass, more prayers before meals, confession if needed. Even when you weren't in church, you might be reading devotional texts or listening to them read aloud. It was less about personal spirituality and more about optics. A visibly devout princess made her husband's court look good. If you didn't attend enough services, people whispered. If you were too devout, people whispered differently. It was a fine balance. Pray enough to look holy, but not so much that you seemed like a religious fanatic neglecting your household duties. Daily activities, the boring kind of princess work. So, what did you do between prayers and meals? That depended on your rank, age, and circumstances, but common activities included embroidery and needlework. Yes, the cliché is true. Princesses spent hours stitching tapestries, altar cloths, or handkerchiefs. Some of it was practical. Some of it was just to show off. The stereotype of noble women endlessly sewing wasn't far from reality. And the irony, half of these projects were left unfinished, passed on to the next generation of bored noble women. Overseeing the household. A princess, especially once married, was technically in charge of the domestic staff. This didn't mean scrubbing floors, it meant supervising the people who supervised the people who scrubbed floors. Still, it required a lot of decision-making about food, supplies, and court expenses. Receiving visitors. Courtiers, ambassadors, clergy, everyone wanted a moment of your time. Some came with petitions, others just to flatter or gossip. Sitting in your chamber, nodding politely while people droned on about land disputes was a surprisingly big part of the job. Leisure pursuits. Music, reading aloud, if you were literate, which not all were, chess, falconry, and occasionally horseback riding. Though riding was tricky in heavy skirts, so many princesses just stuck to gardens and pavilions. All of this was done in the company of attendants. Being alone was rare. Your ladies-in-waiting were basically glued to your side, part entourage, part surveillance system. Meals, displaying wealth one course at a time. When midday rolled around, it was time for the main meal of the day, dinner. And it wasn't eaten privately in a quiet room. Meals were often semi-public affairs, with nobles, servants, and sometimes random hangers-on present. Eating was as much a performance as a necessity. Food was served in multiple courses: roasted meats, pies, stews, bread, cheese, fruits, nuts. Spices were a big deal: cinnamon, saffron, cloves, because importing them was expensive, so using them screamed wealth. Was the food delicious? Sometimes. But it was also heavy, greasy, and not particularly hygienic. Dishes were shared, hand washing was mandatory before and after, and forks weren't widely used until later centuries. So yes, even princesses often ate with their fingers, daintily tearing meat while trying not to get gravy on their jewel-encrusted sleeves.
Wine and ale flowed freely, usually watered down. Water was considered unsafe, so even children drank diluted alcohol. which might explain why so many medieval royals looked permanently flushed in portraits. Etiquette, the invisible cage. Meals also highlighted the strict etiquette princesses lived under. Every movement was dictated by custom. Which hand to use, when to bow your head, how to pass a cup, all mattered. A single faux pas could lead to whispers about your upbringing, your worthiness, or even your country of origin. It wasn't just meals. Etiquette ruled everything. How you walked, how you sat, how you spoke. A princess wasn't supposed to laugh loudly, frown too openly, or show too much emotion in public. You were expected to be the calm center of the storm, a decorative moral compass, basically. Of course, behind closed doors, many princesses did vent their frustrations. Letters survive where they complain about their treatment, their husbands, or their isolation. But in public, always serene, always composed. Afternoon, more duties, more displays. Afternoons were a repeat of the morning cycle. More audiences, more prayers, more embroidery. Occasionally, there were hunts or tournaments to attend, where you sat in a cushioned box and clapped politely while knights tried to stab each other for your amusement. Princesses rarely participated directly. They were the prize, not the players. A knight might dedicate his performance to you or ride with your sleeve tied to his lance as a favor. Your role was to look honored and bestow a smile. Basically, you were the medieval equivalent of a brand ambassador. Evening, supper, and socializing. The evening meal, supper, was lighter than midday dinner, but still formal. Afterwards came entertainment, music, storytelling, poetry, or games. Sometimes this meant listening to troubadours sing endlessly about unrequited love. Sometimes it meant playing chess while trying not to yawn. After supper, more prayers. Because the medieval day wasn't complete without at least 6 or 7 reminders that God was watching. Nighttime, back to the drafty bed. Finally, bedtime. You'd be undressed by attendants, tucked under heavy blankets, and sometimes even watched as you fell asleep. Again, privacy was not a priority. In marriage, of course, the husband might join, often with witnesses ensuring that the union was consummated. Yes, wedding nights were occasionally public business, complete with observers who literally checked the sheets the next morning. Subtlety was not a medieval specialty. Once the candles were snuffed, you drifted off in your stone chamber, hoping the fire didn't go out, the rats stayed in the corners, and your ladies didn't gossip too loudly as they dozed nearby. So, a princess's glamorous life? More embroidery, etiquette, and constant supervision than anyone would wish for. Basically, a combination of convent discipline and reality TV scrutiny without the fun of modern skincare routines. In Part 3, we'll drift deeper into specific examples, the real medieval princesses whose lives showed just how strange, sad, or occasionally hilarious this system could be. Think of Isabella of France, Margaret of Anjou, or poor Catherine of Aragon, who spent more of her life being strategically married than actually happy. Part 3. Princesses in Practice, the real lives behind the titles. So far, we've painted the general picture, drafty castles, endless embroidery, political marriages. But let's put a few names to those faceless princess gowns. Because the stories of real women often reveal just how strange, frustrating, or ironically tragic the whole business could be. Isabella of France, the she-wolf who started out as a child bride. Let's begin with Isabella of France. She's best remembered as the she-wolf of France, which is honestly a pretty metal nickname, considering she started out as a 12-year-old princess being sent to England to marry Edward II. Picture it, you're a French princess, daughter of King Philip IV, a man nicknamed the Fair, though he was also terrifying and cold. You're raised in the Parisian court, steeped in etiquette, piety, and politics. And at the ripe age of 12, you're bundled off across the channel to marry the English king. Sounds like a grand adventure. Except Edward II was, let's say, not the ideal husband. He was deeply attached to his male favorites, first Piers Gaveston, later Hugh Despenser, to the point where Isabella was essentially sidelined in her own marriage. She was supposed to be the queen consort of England, but she often found herself broke, neglected, and treated as an afterthought. Yet, Isabella wasn't just a passive victim. Over the years, she adapted. She played the role, raised children, and quietly endured. But eventually, her patience snapped. By her late 20s, Isabella had aligned herself with her lover, Roger Mortimer, and together they led a rebellion against Edward II. The result? Edward was deposed, imprisoned, and likely murdered in captivity. Isabella briefly ruled England as regent for her young son, Edward III. So yes, the little girl who started out as a diplomatic pawn ended up toppling a king. Not bad for someone originally treated like a decorative treaty. Margaret of Anjou, the queen who wouldn't sit still. Now let's float over to Margaret of Anjou, who married Henry VI of England in the mid-15th century. Margaret was French nobility, plucked at age 15 to marry the mentally fragile Henry during the chaos of the 100 Years' War. If Isabella of France was sidelined by her husband, Margaret had the opposite problem. Her husband was basically incapable of ruling. Henry VI suffered from bouts of catatonic mental illness, during which he couldn't even recognize people. So Margaret had to step up. This was not what medieval princesses were supposed to do. They were meant to smile quietly, produce heirs, and embroider discreetly in the background. But Margaret, she went full political player. She took charge of her faction, rallied armies, and became one of the driving forces of the Wars of the Roses. Of course, this made her wildly unpopular. The English nobility hated being bossed around by a Frenchwoman. Pamphlets painted her as a scheming harpy. Chroniclers described her as ruthless, ambitious, and unfeminine, all because she dared to wield actual power while her husband stared at the wall. Her story ended badly. She was eventually captured, imprisoned, and sent back to France, where she died in relative obscurity. But for a brief time, Margaret shattered the princess's pawn stereotype. She grabbed the chessboard and flipped it over. Catherine of Aragon, the princess who waited. And then there's Catherine of Aragon. Born to Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, the royal power couple who sponsored Columbus, she was married off to Prince Arthur of England at just 15. Her wedding was magnificent. Her future looked secure. But 5 months later, Arthur was dead, and Catherine was left stranded in England, a widow before she'd even turned 16. This put her in a deeply awkward spot. She was still young, still valuable as a dynastic pawn, but sending her back to Spain would mean returning her hefty dowry. The English weren't keen on that. So Catherine lingered in a kind of royal limbo for years, half neglected, half courted, waiting to see what would happen. Eventually, she was married to Arthur's younger brother, Henry VIII. At first, this seemed like a happy match. Catherine was intelligent, pious, and genuinely devoted to her husband. But then Henry got bored and desperate for a son. When Catherine failed to produce surviving male heirs, Henry began his infamous quest to annul the marriage. The result, of course, was the English Reformation, a total religious upheaval that permanently altered European history. All because a princess did exactly what she was told, but biology didn't cooperate. Catherine ended her life banished to a gloomy castle, still insisting she was Henry's true wife. A lifetime of obedience, and her reward was being erased.
Blanche of Castile, the exception who thrived. Not every princess tale is doom and gloom. Blanche of Castile, another Spanish-born royal, married Louis VIII of France in the early 13th century. Unlike many of her peers, Blanche actually thrived in her role. When Louis died young, Blanche became regent for her son, the future Saint Louis IX. And instead of fading into the background, she ruled with competence and authority. She managed finances, suppressed rebellions, and even personally led negotiations with nobles who tried to overthrow her. Blanche wasn't universally loved. She was strict, devout, and often accused of being overbearing. But she held power successfully, and her son went on to become one of France's most revered kings. That's not bad for someone who was originally shipped off as yet another political bride. Common threads. As we float through these lives, the pattern emerges. Some princesses faded into the background, living quiet, unhappy lives defined by marriages and childbirth. Others, often when circumstances forced them, stepped into the spotlight and wielded power directly. But whether passive or active, none of them ever had real control at the start. They were all born as dynastic tools, traded and shipped across Europe like high-value parcels. What's fascinating is how differently they responded to that role. Isabella overthrew her husband. Margaret fought like a general. Catherine clung stubbornly to duty. Blanche leaned into authority. Same system, wildly different outcomes. And yet, even the successful ones lived under constant scrutiny, pressure, and the looming possibility of disaster. Royal privilege didn't protect them from isolation, slander, or tragedy. In fact, it often amplified those things. The princess fantasy versus reality. So when we think about medieval princesses, it's worth holding the contrast in mind. On one side, the fantasy. Gowns, castles, crowns, fairy tales. On the other side, the reality. Homesickness, political bargaining, reproductive pressure, and public judgment. It wasn't misery all the time. There were moments of luxury, affection, even joy. But the core truth is that medieval princess life was a performance, carefully staged for dynastic survival. Some princesses played their roles quietly. Some ripped up the script. But none of them had the carefree life of a fairy tale heroine. And with that, let's dim the lights further. In Part 4, we'll drift into the strange details, the medical treatments, the beauty rituals, the weird superstitions that shaped princess life behind the curtain. Because nothing says sweet dreams quite like lead face powder, leech therapy, and the constant fear of childbirth. Part 4. The odd realities of princess life, medicine, beauty, and superstitions. So we've seen the big picture. Princesses as dynastic pawns embroidering their way through days filled with prayers and politics. But what about the smaller details, the kind that don't usually make it into the fairy tale version? Because behind every golden crown was a headache from too tight headgear. Behind every radiant face was probably a rash from toxic makeup. And behind every ceremonial pregnancy was a medieval doctor waving around a jar of leeches, confidently claiming he could balance your humors. Let's wander through that softer, weirder side of princess life. Medieval medicine, the art of being wrong with confidence. If you were a medieval princess and you got sick, which happened often, because everyone did, your treatments came courtesy of doctors whose main qualification was the ability to quote Galen and look serious while bleeding you half to death. The reigning medical theory was the four humors. Health, they believed, was all about balance between blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Too much of one humor? Well, that caused everything from headaches to infertility. The solution? Remove or counteract it. So, if a princess had a fever, doctors might apply leeches to her skin to draw out excess blood. If she had indigestion, they'd recommend purging. If she felt weak, maybe a tonic of ground pearls mixed in wine. Yes, pearls, because why not drink crushed jewelry in the name of health? Herbs, charms, and poultices were common too. Chamomile, rosemary, sage, some of which actually had mild benefits, though no one could explain why. They were just lumped into the great medieval philosophy of worth a try. And of course, astrology was often consulted. A princess's treatment could be delayed until the stars were aligned favorably, because who wants to have their blood drained under the wrong zodiac sign? That would be reckless. Childbirth, the most dangerous job requirement. Of all the medical concerns, childbirth was the deadliest. A medieval princess might spend her entire adult life pregnant, and each pregnancy carried real risk. Hemorrhage, infection, prolonged labor. Even with the best attendants, mortality rates were brutal. Midwives oversaw the process, sometimes joined by doctors if things went badly. Herbal infusions, prayers, relics of saints, all were pressed into service to help the mother survive. But there was no anesthesia, antibiotics, and no real understanding of infection. For royal families, the pressure was doubled. Producing heirs wasn't just personal, it was political. A princess who died in childbirth wasn't just a tragedy, it could spark a succession crisis. But sympathy was usually limited. Queens were expected to risk their lives repeatedly until the dynasty had enough sons. One chronicler dryly noted that the queen did her duty and bore another prince. Translation, congratulations, she survived this round. Let's see if she makes it to the next. Beauty standards, the toxic pursuit of paleness. Now let's talk about beauty. Because medieval princesses weren't just political symbols, they were supposed to be physically flawless representations of dynastic glory. The ideal? Pale skin, high forehead, delicate features, long flowing hair. Basically the look of someone who had never lifted anything heavier than a rosary. To achieve that glow, women often turned to cosmetics, which were dangerous. Lead-based powders were used to whiten the skin. Mercury was mixed into ointments. Both caused long-term damage, but hey, at least you looked aristocratically ghostly in candlelight. Eyebrows were plucked into thin lines or sometimes shaved entirely to create the illusion of a higher forehead. Yes, big foreheads were trendy. Women literally removed hair to emphasize theirs. Because nothing says beauty like a scalp that begins halfway back on your head. As for hair itself, blonde was highly prized. If you weren't naturally fair, there were concoctions to lighten hair. Some involving lye, others involving sitting in the sun with vinegar slathered on your scalp. The results were mixed. At best, you got lighter strands. At worst, you fried your hair into medieval straw. Perfume and scented waters helped cover the general lack of bathing. Rose water, lavender oil, musk. A princess was expected to smell like a garden, even if her laundry smelled like damp wool. Fashion, pain as prestige. We've touched on clothes, but let's lean in a little. Princess fashion wasn't about comfort, it was about broadcasting status. The heavier, more elaborate, and less practical the outfit, the better. Fashion, absolutely. Long trailing sleeves that dragged in the dirt. Fashion. Gowns with so much embroidery they could stand up on their own. Fashion. Tight bodices that restricted breathing. Absolutely fashion. Furs were a winter staple, but not always glamorous. A princess might wear ermine, miniver, or sable. They looked luxurious, but castles were smoky and fur absorbed odors like sponges. So your priceless ermine-lined cloak might smell faintly of roast mutton and damp hearth smoke. Shoes were often delicate and decorative, not meant for real walking, which was fine because princesses weren't supposed to stomp around like peasants anyway. Graceful gliding was the goal, even if your toes were freezing and your ankles ached. Superstitions, the quiet background noise. And then there were the little rituals, the charms, the superstitions that seeped into daily life. Even the most pious princesses often kept a few talismans tucked away. Amulets against infertility, charms against miscarriage, rings with inscriptions said to cure headaches, relics of saints sewn into clothing for protection during travel. Dreams were read as omens. Certain animals crossing your path could be considered lucky or disastrous. A sudden illness might be seen as divine punishment or the result of someone's curse. Princesses surrounded by chaplains and confessors weren't supposed to believe in such things. But behind closed doors, many did. Because when your life is full of danger and uncertainty, you'll take any comfort you can get. Loneliness and luxury. And maybe the strangest detail of all, despite the wealth, the gowns, the jewels, many princesses were crushingly lonely. They were often foreigners in their new courts, cut off from their families, surrounded by servants who reported their every word.
Their marriages were political, not romantic. Their friends were chosen for them. Their lives were scheduled down to the hour. Even their letters were monitored. Writing to their parents or siblings required careful diplomacy, lest anyone accuse them of divided loyalties. Some princesses wrote plaintive notes begging for news from home or describing their isolation in quiet, heartbreaking lines. So yes, the world saw glittering crowns and feasts, but the princess herself might see only a gilded cage, day after day, embroidered into tedium. A reality check. All of this makes the fairy tale image collapse pretty quickly. Medieval princess life wasn't a dream of gowns and tiaras. It was a grind of expectation, discomfort, and danger, wrapped in velvet and perfumed with rosewater. Did some enjoy it? Absolutely. Some princesses leaned into the role, relished the wealth, and carved out influence. Others endured with resignation. Still others rebelled when they could. But none of them lived the carefree fantasy. Every stitch of embroidery, every layer of powder, every ceremonial procession was part of a larger system that treated them as instruments of dynastic survival. And that's where we'll leave this part, in the quiet chambers of a medieval princess, perfumed, powdered, painted pale, and wondering what tomorrow's prayers and obligations will bring.